I brought you two together to talk about the Rolemaster game we played last year, and I definitely did not start recording and then realize I had the wrong video and have to start over again. Uh, how did you feel about engaging with the premise of the game? Which was, well, maybe now that I'm warmed up a little, I will explain the premise. But I made this. I feel more talkative now. I made this. Pardon me. I made this group of islands called Vun, and this had been like ever since I had the conversation about Rolemaster with Sean. I had sort of gotten into building these worlds and creating these maps, trying to do like a Rolemaster thing where I kind of take campaign law at face value and try to actually do like what they're suggesting you do in terms of building a world in there. And I had a couple of iterations of this that were kind of like, well, the first iteration of this is kind of like, I called it 40 lands, and then 40 was too many lands. I've talked about this with you before, but we got down to when I made this Vun little island setting, it's got like 13 different cultures, and as we found, I even kind of decided that was too much. We can talk about that later, but I made this little setting and then had this idea that you as the players would be traveling to this setting as a kind of religious embassy, and that's something I got from a real life embassy where Japanese Christians sent Japanese Christian lords sent some of their sons to Europe with some minders and bodyguards. And I thought that was an interesting premise, and so I kind of like translated that to my own little setting, and had you two make up these characters to like kind of engage with that. And so if you want to just kind of talk about how it felt to go through the character creation process and engage with the premise and so on, first of all, we can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had my characters I created were Vero, who was a cleric, his profession cleric, and was part of this religious establishment, and I considered him a Orthodox member of this religion and involved in this mission and very committed to it. And then the other character I had was Palem, whose profession was a thief, but I conceptualized him as a spy who was pretending to be a merchant and was sort of involved in this too, not so much because of any religious belief, although he certainly is a faithful person, but because he thought this could be helpful for the political interests of the home country back across the water. So those are the characters I came up with, and so one thing that was great about the premise is that it was pretty grabby in terms of like, I didn't have to think too hard to like figure out where to kind of orient the characters towards that and kind of give them some motivation and some extra ideas around that. And then I think it did do a nice job of giving some reason for doing the adventuring type stuff, which is, I mean, and maybe this is jumping ahead, but I think that Rolemaster shines when you have a little bit more complicated kind of cultural context for the activity of the characters, rather than kind of just kind of dungeon delving or just sort of like, oh, here's the bad guys we're fighting next. Like, there's enough just in terms of like kind of the combat system alone, which can take out your character, even if not killing it, but can like really sideline your character for long periods of game time because of the healing rules and everything like that. It's helpful. Like, you kind of want the context of any conflict to have some meaning for the characters and to have a kind of like narrative thematic oomph
Yeah.
in order to kind of really make that come to life and be worth it.
Right.
If that makes sense. So I appreciated that, and it's when I've been thinking, I was sort of thinking, not when I had been kind of thinking of running Rolemaster 2, and I was the premise I was kind of thinking was somewhat different, but it was also, after playing in your game, kind of just pushing me in that same direction of like making sure that that there is this kind of context for this context for the activity that's not that's a little more complicated.
Yeah, and I think that's clear from campaign law that that's what they want to. I mean, it doesn't talk about making dungeons at all. It talks about
Right.
like, oh, populate the world with these different cultures, and then you can debate on whether some of their, you know, some of the suggestions are doable, such as like developing complete linguistic histories for all the cultures. I I gave it a shot, but it does kind of want you to be wandering around in these different cultural areas, I think. And
Yeah, I think so. I had two characters, and the other constraint that you gave us was that one would be a fighter, one would be some kind of
right, yeah,
magic
that's right.
user. So I call it a channeler or a sorcerer or something like that.
Yeah, I think you were playing
And
a mentalist. Yeah, your
so-
guy, your second guy was.
yeah, so we ended up with a fighter named Tertius Tav, who was um, kind of a kind of washed out of the Imperial Army and looking to take enough money to not end up a homeless derelict, and then Guest Theron, who was um, a mentalist, so brought up in this kind of like religion within the larger religion back in the home country, and you'd given one thing I think I really appreciated about the about what you brought to the premise was that the you had a very rich sense of like what the magic meant to the culture. So
Hmm.
we definitely were playing like role master mentalism, role master channeling. We were playing like what those meant, in this world that you'd created. And then I noticed, so I noticed like with guests that I was trying to draw on that and honor it. And then with Tav, I was trying to draw on just like what I know about, foreign wars in empires, and have a character who's kind of meaningfully resonant with my understanding of that. And and yeah, having all four of those characters in one group was definitely interesting, and I think it gave us a lot of angles to play between our characters, John and me.
Okay. Yeah, and well, go ahead, John. Sorry, I'm a little
I was
distracted.
just going to say, in terms of Rolemaster, just I guess in case people, I don't know if people watching this video are going to be like, oh, I'm not familiar with Rolemaster. The actual character creation itself, you're not required to kind of the baseline character creation. You choose your profession and then you roll your statistics, and the skill choice for the main professions is all sort of you're sort of all all thieves kind of have the same sort of skills,
Yeah.
and you have some degree of customization, but it's not a huge amount. But we did add in the secondary skill rules, which does provide, I think, quite a bit of specialization and kind of characterization, like nailing them, like kind of a little bit more portraiture in terms of making my thief, who I'm conceptualizing as a spy, I'm able to give them secondary skills like trickery and falsification and things like that. So you actually can kind of have a nice portraiture of these characters that's system based, and not just not just sort of free, not just sort of this unconstrained, characterization of it, but there's a little bit of the systemic support for that type of, dialing these guys into kind of who they are specifically, right. Or like kind of bringing them to life in this way.
Yeah. And okay. Sorry, I had to take a little break to adjust some settings. So, John, you were just talking about getting a portrait of the characters from your choices, and like
the secondary skills.
Well, with the secondary skills, I remember that Vero's like oratory or public speaking secondary skills actually turned out to be really important throughout the campaign. It did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of being an all-purpose social skill, which is not something there's a lot of in the game, I think. Like
social skills.
There is an interaction and influence table, but there's not, which is what we use for your public speaking. But I don't know that there were a ton of like different, like some games have like, well, you can bargain or persuade or orate or preach. And
is it a little bit of that you've got, like you can, like there's, like I say, there's like trickery.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Not as much. It's not as, it is not as delineated as, for example, Legendary Lives.
Right. Well, that's what I was thinking of, really.
Which gives several, where you really need to think about how you're, approaching each situation, each social situation, and kind of what it falls under. But this is a little looser than that. But I think it worked pretty well. Like I feel like we weren't. It felt. It didn't feel like we were.
No, I agree. I think
missing something per se.
I think it went fine. And so that was.
And just like in terms of kind of how the things happened, one thing I appreciated about playing 16 or 18 sessions is we really got to know the characters, but we also kind of came in with maybe one of the open questions was what the nature of our mission, in Eternal Vun was.
Right.
And just by virtue of early on, Vero made a really critical oratory role that won a lot of people over. And so, even though I think Vero was kind of the only true believer on this religious mission, we actually kind of found out, we found ourselves to be on a genuinely kind of religiously stamped mission, and it felt like that we weren't receiving that, from you, Rod. That was something that really came up in play and could have gone differently, I think given a critical failure on that role, we might have ended up someplace completely different in terms of how we conceptualized our mission and presented it to other characters. That was really fun to see.
Yeah, no, that was neat. And so, like in terms of the content itself, so when we started playing, right, I had this map with all these different cultures, and I started you in one of them. I started you in this Northern Islands culture. I'll probably put the map on the video when I edit this, but I had a lot of detail about this culture, about how there were these different clans, and they had these trees, and there were like different clans had different trees with different magic powers, and they made armor from the rinds of the fruit of the trees, and they made different things from the different tree products. And this is sort of like where you came in, and I kind of explained this to you, and I kind of several times over the course of the game, I kind of stopped to kind of like worry or fret about whether this was coming off like a CIA fact book, like I was just dropping all this exposition on you. It was kind of a lot, but and in terms of my own prep, I think the expectations of like having this level of detail in every one of the cultures potentially was what ultimately kind of led me to conclude the game earlier, because I was just like, I had done all this for this culture, and then like doing it again for another section was kind of like where I hit the wall and was like, okay, I think this is too much. But well, while we were playing, it did get pretty interesting, and you kind of interacted with these characters in a lot of interesting ways. But so like you came into this new place and sort of like I kind of presented you with these different possibilities, and I kind of presented you with this starting like adventure area, kind of like very self-consciously designated. This is where the adventure is, where there was this,
Yeah.
you know, magical research place where they were trying to grow more productive trees, and it turned into a disaster, and the trees spewed resin everywhere and created like sort of drowned this facility in this lake of resin. So it was really, I enjoyed making that place. It felt really, really visually vivid and neat to me. But and then I kind of basically pointed you in that direction and sort of suggested you might do something like that. And if like, how did you respond overall to just coming into the setting in general, and then specifically having this thing like pointed out to you? I don't know if that was, I still like, it's probably fine. I don't know that there's necessarily another way to get it kicked off, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
I don't think it's functionally much different than like the way I run like Tunnels and Trolls or Dungeons and Dragons, where I say like, okay, you guys are starting at the dungeon.
yeah.
The difference being that it was important to have some, like we actually did have some meaningful choices. Like we played we had meaningful choices in the play leading up to that, even though we were like, okay, this is the premise and this is where we're gonna start. But like in terms of like the relationships between us and the people the kind of the people from Fun who were like joining us, or like what their thoughts were about us, or like as Noah was talking about, kind of the religious tenor, or the kind of religious aspect that the characters felt about it. That was all kind of play in. We came to that in play.
Yeah.
Prior to us going to the dungeon, and then so saying like, well, and it's not a dungeon, I know.
Yeah.
But going to the place of exploration, right? So that, I think that seems perfectly functional and fine. Like it seems like we're here to do this. Like so, like yeah, of course the characters are going to go to this, and I don't think it's like,
What?
It's not a. It's what's. It's not like we know Rod prepared this, so we're just going to go along with it.
Right.
Because that's where he laid the railroad tracks or whatever. It isn't that. It's that. The premise of what we're doing involves this thing, and we're gonna go see what happens when we interact with it, because that's kind of why we're here.
Yeah.
With the understanding and trust that like actually you're gonna honor like the characters' opinions and thoughts about it, as well as like once we get there, like who knows what's gonna happen, and we're gonna see if things change or like what they decide to do. I mean, because ultimately like it ended up being sort of a complicated thing, because our first visit there didn't go great.
Yeah.
Nor did our second, for that matter. But
yeah, well, the
second visit went better.
Yeah, well, we could talk about what specifically happened, because there was a lot of use of the mechanics in those kind of like things where I really sort of dug into, like I made a little map of like a mile square and tracked you on the map and rolled for encounter. So there was this idea that this clan who had had this huge magical accident was like expunged by the other clans for heresy, or I forget what I called it, like dark magic or whatever. But
Yeah.
there was some kind of like holdover. There were some allied clans who were sort of like left high and dry, who were now like bandits in the area, who were hostile to the other clans and felt they had been betrayed. And so you were sort of going towards this place in a little, not, I say wilderness because that's kind of like the old Dungeons and Dragons terms, but through the countryside, I guess is right.
Yeah.
Where there are these hostile, kind of resentful bandits lurking around, and like you never got in a fight with them, but like kind of checking periodically to see if they were around or if you would see evidence, or if like it was interesting in that you sort of made decisions about trying to avoid like places where they might set up an ambush. And I think I had characters from the culture. You had hired some warriors from the culture who could kind of like be the spokesman for, well, this is what we think they would think or they would do.
Yeah.
And so
and like we were staying with some peasants too, and
yeah,
we kind of intuited that these bandits probably aren't surviving out here without support from with houses and crops. So even in interacting, trying to figure out if we could get a place to stay, we were already having to weigh some complex social considerations. Like, are they someone gonna run off and tell the bandits that we're here? They'll come cut our throats, So yeah. And with the encounter rules, I think the social situation felt very alive.
yeah, and the encounter roles are sort of interesting. I think they sort of work really well in this situation where you're kind of like in a hostile and known hostile environment, and you check to see like, because you can sort of like, you have these modifiers where how many people are in your party, like, do you have more or less?
Yeah.
Are you going to try to go slowly and quietly, or are you going to try to go straight to where you're going? And you kind of modulate your approach to moving through the environment, and that kind of determines whether you get like puts a modifier on the roll, which will determine whether you get a sighting or just a regular encounter or a hostile encounter where they actually attack. And it seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, I think I've talked about this before, but the Lord of the Rings is kind of like a big influence on the origins of the game.
Yeah.
And if you think about like the early scenes where the hobbits are sort of creeping around the wilderness with the ring wraiths chasing them, and they're trying to hide in different places, I think there's kind of a big consonance where like the encounter tables are really thinking of that kind of situation when they were created. Is kind of the impression I got. And so in this case, where you're kind of like creeping through the environment, or maybe there's an ambush or maybe there isn't, I think that they worked really well for like setting that kind of scene too. And that's sort of like taking the encounter tables at face value, where you're like rolling twice a day as you move like 4 miles or 8 miles or 12 miles. But I also sort of have in mind that you could do something different with the encounter tables, where you kind of step out a level of an abstraction. I think I've talked about this with you, John, maybe about playing a game where you do more like a week at a time.
Right. Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
it's kind of like what happens in Bushido, right? Like, and you check for an encounter for every week, and then the encounter for the week then is like you develop it into a full situation. And so that's kind of like, I was thinking about be another way to use those tables, or to use that idea. But in terms of using them as they're presented.
Although in Bushido, if you're traveling, you're supposed to roll for an encounter every day.
Oh, okay.
But
well,
interesting.
But you could all. But I agree with you could certainly. It certainly would be. I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities in the way you can use Bushido and Rolemaster.
Yeah.
Bushido has a lot more fully thought out or fully formed in terms of the system, and in terms of having all sorts of things that have subsystems that are mechanized. But they share, I think, they share some similarities in terms of like what you can do with them, because they have this idea that if by paying attention to these details, we're gonna generate new material that it's gonna change the situation.
Yeah. Actually, I think this comparison between Rolemaster and Bushido helps me with something I've been trying to articulate about how campaign law. So Bushido benefits from being about a very specific place and having a lot of rules support the idea of creating like the notion of this, this place, this medieval Japan, or maybe it's a little fantasized, but it's, for presumably for the research materials they had, it's pretty rigorous, I guess. If you just read Sansome's History of Japan. But campaign law, I think, there's something that's kind of like makes it a little difficult to conceptualize how you get into it, in that it has a very specific procedural idea about what playing in a campaign is, but there's no specific campaign. There's no specific setting, and everything about making the setting is real way back and hands off, and like, well, you could make these cultures this way, or you could make them that way, or you could make them whatever. So it is kind of like you have to have the fantasy within you already to bring it to Rolemaster before you can kind of use these procedures.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so
that's what I've found just when I'm kind of doodling in my notebook about kind of when I'm imagining doing Rolemaster. It's like I've already got the fantasy idea that I think, Rolemaster would really bring it to life. But but I'm not like, it's not like I'm reading. I'm not inspired. It's not like reading the Rolemaster text. Is inspiring me for the fantasy. It's sort of
right. It's like a way to implement it. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are some intrinsic fantasy elements to Rolemaster, like the magic in particular. It has a very specific idea of like, well, there's these 3 schools, and they kind of all, like, the idea that they all stem from the same source ultimately is actually in the books. Like, they all are technically using essence, but are different ways of interacting with essence. And so that's kind of like where I got the thing in my campaign, where you sort of start running into these beings that seem to predate like a division between the different types of magic. But that's still fairly abstract. It's not like there's a history of the schools of magic in the book. It's just like, well, there's 3 types, and it's like you figure out what to do with it.
Which I like that about it. I don't.
Yeah, no.
But it does sort of like I think like if you want to come to it with like an idea, the type of idea you had, for sure.
Yeah. And so, what were we talking about before? So like approaching the adventure. We talked about approaching the adventure side of it and using those kind of encounter tables.
Random encounter tables, yeah.
And then so when we came to the adventure site, this is where I had like a very specific idea of what I wanted to do based on kind of like our experiences in Sean's game, where I was kind of like trying to figure out where we were learning about what you could do with the combat system, and I was trying to like push like what would make the things I'm interested in more interesting. And one big thing is the exhaustion points, right? That every character has these exhaustion points that you kind of expend as you move or fight or do stuff, but you can expend more to accelerate your movement, and accelerating your movement potentially lets you make attacks that you wouldn't have been able to make otherwise, because you can get places with less of your activity percentage. And then, if you move half of your speed, you can only attack it in melee if you move half your speed, right? But what if your speed is 5 times normal? Then you can go a lot farther and still attack. That kind of thing. And so I kind of wanted to push that by those phenomena, by making the encounter, like the combat arenas, just bigger, just physically like hundreds of feet and not like tens of feet. And so, when we first kind of played with that, we had that sort of thing where you were fighting these like possessed lizards, and then there was this giant, frog that came out, and sort of you kind of like made a run for shelter to try to avoid this frog. Well, some people were fighting this frog, some people were trying to run for shelter, and like the interactions of like figuring out how fast you could go, and the fact that when you're under stress you have to make these movement and maneuver rolls, so you don't actually know how far you're going to get to go on your turn, which is it's interesting that not many games have picked that up as a mechanic. As far as I can tell, it's fairly rare.
It's such a great idea.
Yeah.
It's quite great. Like, I don't know if they realized how great it was, or if that's how people actually played it. How dedicated they were to it. We'll have to ask David, because I know he played a lot back in the day. But yeah. So that you can be, you have control. So you have complete control over your pace, which is sort of that right. multiplier of your potential multiplier of your movement, but you don't. But you're rolling, and so you have you maybe have a good sense of what that roll might be, but you can't guarantee that you're actually going to be able to move the full distance when you're under stress.
Right.
And that uncertainty involved, throwing that uncertainty into the movement makes it so much more interesting to me than a game where you're like, oh, I know that I can be there.
Yeah.
I can definitely put my guy there on the board. It's adding some uncertainty, and it's like making it much more dynamic. And almost all the situations really got into it where that really was meaningful. Like, oh, you try to make a dash towards an opponent to do something, and you fall short. And how often does that happen in role playing doesn't tend to kind of model that very well. Unless we're more abstract, if you abstract it out, then okay, we can say oh, I failed the conflict roll, I must have not gotten there.
Yeah.
But to actually have we're kind of moving the characters around on a map, and we're seeing that falling short. It's really powerful stuff. So, and then adding the exhaustion points in is really helps too, because then you're really deciding what's meaningful or not. What is it worth to put yourself at risk for? Because once you're out of the exhaustion points, you don't get them back in any time. That's going to help you in a combat.
Yeah.
It ended up feeling like kind of what initiative wants to be in some other games, because you kind of there's not a lot of randomness in Rolemaster on when you go, but not knowing to the danger you're going to be is very exciting. And especially in the ruined temple we were playing, there were a lot of tiers to the architecture. There were stairs, so you'd roll to get someplace and escape the enemies or get to a more advantageous position, and then find that you had this very unique profile of where people were, and it was never
I do remember that one, a couple of turns where we were rolling for basically everyone in the party, and they kind of ended up strung out on this, and they had very different threats and opportunities based on what they would need to do next, based on how far they had gotten. That was really, I think that was really the kind of one of the standout moments. That, and I think the fight on the beach with the crabs and the chimeric sea lion. And that was again another situation where there was a big, I basically recreated the same situation where there were some little opponents, and then there was a big creature that sort of blundered into the situation, and someone had to run out of the surf, and could he make it, or would he get caught by the thing? But
and when Palem was when we wrapped up our time at the ruined temple, there was kind of a fight with the remaining lizards who were doing their last stand, and a lot of the terrain was difficult, so the lizards were able to navigate it at full speed, and we had
Right.
to navigate at a very reduced, randomized speeds. Like the
Yeah.
table you're rolling on is a lot sharper,
Right.
and Palem managed, if I recall, to roll very well getting out toward the lizards, and then when they started swarming him and he tried to get back, he rolled really badly trying to get back as they overtook him. And I remember that
Yeah.
being really fun as we were like, oh, like this could be it for Palem.
Yeah, he needed to get out of there. He realized. And if he had, I mean, and it could have worked a little better that he could have gotten over there safely and done something, but it started to turn against him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Joe did pretty well, though.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a good time to talk a little bit about, well, just like this is more my prepared speech about the critical hit tables, but in Rolemaster, right, the critical, when you take a critical hit, like it's going to be a severity of A through E, and those are each a different table you roll on. It's going to be like piercing or slashing or whatever, but each table has a range from like fairly inconsequential or minor hits to more severe hits, and they get more severe as the tables go up, but there are still weak nothing hits on like the E table. And like the first quarter to third of each table is kind of more or less survivable, or has just extra hits as opposed to like impactful, like you get stunned or you get like badly maimed or whatever. And so there's kind of a thing where the critical hits are not necessarily, like statistically I think you have more chance of surviving a critical hit than maybe is traditionally thought of in the culture. And I think I've talked about how I think this might be stemming from Middle Earth role playing as well, because in Middle Earth the tables are actually statistically very different. There's one table for critical hit type, and if you get a D or an E, you add a bonus to your roll, so you're not rolling on a separate table with a similar probability distribution. You're definitely pushing your chances higher up the one table. So I think it's actually more more lethal in Middle Earth than it is in Rolemaster, potentially. Just statistically speaking, that's kind of a diversion, but something I just thought I'd throw in there just because I like talking about it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I think there's like it seems like still like even on an E puncture critical about you're not getting a instant kill for the most part until you're up above 80.
Right. And even where's like the first stun on that?
The first stun for an E puncture is the first stun is happening at 45.
45. Okay, so close to halfway up the table, right? And that's
Yeah.
and like the stuns are really consequential. I mean, that's kind of really what you're usually hoping for in terms of hitting an opponent, and because it's gonna stop their aggression and it's gonna make it easier for you to keep trying to kill them, right? So.
And I've said this before, but I do think that I do like that you do get these pretty specific kind of critical results that then lead to, actual wounds, like kind of we have a really clear picture of what the wound is, and then what we need to do, like what's going to happen to the character in terms of kind of the issues that wound is going to give them, and then the healing and the timeline for all that. And I think that really is nice. Like but again, not if you're, and it comes to life again when you're playing with like the context of
enough
I've said this
context.
before. It's like, oh, if we're exploring this other, we're this envoy or an embassy in this place we're going to, and now you get a character who has a wound that is requiring kind of weeks to heal. Like, you need to have some place, like, it's important that you've made connections in the community to like have some place to heal for that time.
Yeah.
And it loses something if you're treating it as like the abstract, oh, we're home from the dungeon and then we're going to rest in town.
Yeah.
It really kind of having the context, that bigger context for it makes it all really worthwhile, and gives it an extra, impact.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And okay, so we talked about that. What else do I have here? Something we could talk about magic a little bit. There's no. You can go ahead, John, but there is one specific. I really wanted to get into that specific session where Noah's mentalist basically had the perfect use case for all of his spells and did this amazing thing. But we can approach that more generally if you have some general thoughts about the magic.
I will say, I feel like the magic is something I need to spend more time with, to think about and look at. And I think that's partly I feel like I didn't do enough reading about the magic kind of before creating my character. And
it is tricky. It is kind of a knowledge maze where you kind of really need to read all these different spell lists and figure out, all right, which ones are actually going to do something for me now, as a first level character or whatever.
Yeah.
So it can be.
And I think that the magic, I do think it, and this is something I've been thinking about, and I think mentioned to you guys too, or maybe not but I've mentioned to Rod, I think, I find where a lot of games from, throughout the history of role-playing, but there's a lot of really good games that were made in the 70s and 80s that the one thing I would kind of change about them, if I could, change, is the progression system, or because they're set up to really be oh, you start out very inconsequential, and then after you play, every week for 15 years, then you're Gandalf or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that for the most part in Rolemaster, I don't feel that way, because I feel like the thief, for example, a thief actually starts as a pretty feeling very kind of competent to do the type of stuff I'd like him to do. And again, the portraiture of a protagonist of a fantasy story is quite strong there. I felt with the magic piece, I felt a little bit they feel it was a little harder to get that, because the magic is just so much of it, and it might just be figuring it out, doing the homework to be oh, actually, I shouldn't have taken this. This is the spell list I should have learned.
Yeah. Well, there's some of that. I did where we were using that extraordinary spell failure table, which is an optional rule that lets you try to cast higher level spells, but there's a chance you'll fry your brain or whatever, as we saw happen one time. Which is another thing to tell you. But it is kind of that's kind of a way to try to get a little more magic juice into the game, but it is still pretty difficult to do magic in the game, and they really want you to they kind of want you to want to be something that you gear up and prep for, but then some of the effects are not really worth gearing up and prepping for. So it's what was I supposed to do with heating a cubic foot of water or whatever, But the thing that I wanted to. Is there anything else? The thing that I wanted to talk about was the time when Noah's mentalist, like, you were trying to get to this like ruined like temple or shrine thing that was like way out in the surf, and Noah's character.
Than the first ruined temple. This was our second
Ruined temple. Yeah, lots of ruins. Yeah. Lots of ruins in this game. The first one was technically a laboratory. It wasn't.
Yeah.
But
and I'll say just on that note, Ron. I'll say, I think in this kind of game you have to feel out like why your adventure, like Tunnels and Trolls. I think that's kind of secondary. Like why you're here, it doesn't really matter. But with us, I mean, I think just the rich and something John has been highlighting a lot, like the richness of the social context.
Yeah.
Is important, but the richness of the cultural context is important too, because like for us, we were kind of coming to these ruins, and I think in a pretty realistic way, because there was a story that our home culture told about this place that wasn't really the one that the people there told about themselves. So, we'd be going to places that seemed very important to us, and people would be like, "Hey, why are you going there?" No one lives there, and so and across all of our expeditions into these ruins, I really appreciated that dynamic.
Yeah. But anyway, so in this one temple in the surf, you had the jump spell that let you jump to the thing, and then you had the vision spell. The vision spell, with this was sort of amazing. There was like the altar that the crab seemed to be worshiping or guarding or whatever, and you were like, I want to cast vision and to see what would happen if I opened the altar, and it was like, I guess you just see what's in there. Like, it hadn't occurred to me, but and then the crabs kill you, but you get to see what's in there, and that was like kind of a really neat, like, the spells just have these sort of like broad, well, this lets you see a minute into the future of like whatever action you're thinking of taking, and like, wow, that's really open-ended, and it's kind of neat, like the spells that are like that are like kind of, even the jump spell is like, it's kind of about getting from one place to another inaccessible place, and that kind of like gives you the spells that give you like situational options that like open up things for you are more fun than spells that like give you like +5 to resist fire or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's definitely kind of a sense in which you might want to go through the spell list and kind of prune for content, but that was neat. John,
and thinking, I mean, I've thought a lot about that session because it was, I mean, one of my, that session was one of my favorites from the past year, and I was thinking, I mean, what happened in the moment was very cool. Like it became a little trippy, a little psychedelic. Guess once he so he saw what was inside the altar, and it was these 2 eggs. So there were basically these infant gods that we then went and were able to extract and kind of bring back. But I mean, again, I think some of what made that so resonant, was all of the cultural material we've been working with, like Guess and Vero. I think I very much enjoyed just the genuine relationship between them, because Vero is like it's very orthodox, religious cleric, and Guess is part of this kind of secretly heretical mentalist sect, and so we were having discussions about politics and and religion and the source of divinity, and then suddenly we found ourselves with these creatures that were from before mentalism and channeling split, and might actually have the answers to these things we've been talking about. And so I don't know, like as much as I enjoyed what happened in that moment, I also felt like a lot of the depth of it and the emotional texture of it was because we'd been playing these characters in the everyday in this genuine way. That kind of gave the grounding to that wonder. And that's kind of something I've been definitely thinking about, right? Is kind of how it's So we often kind of conceptualize like you play the everyday stuff to get to the wondrous stuff.
Hmm.
But then I've also been thinking, maybe you go through the wondrous stuff so you can like talk about it afterwards with your friend,
Right.
and like, and I felt like we,
Yeah.
just going in and out of these dramatic situations, we got to experience that a little bit,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. John, you mentioned progression earlier, and like I can talk about that a little bit. Like Rolemaster, like the progression system, the XP in the Rolemaster looks pretty daunting, and so that's I was kind of looking for ways to like part of the reason I like went hard on like religion as a organizing principle of what was going on in the game was because one of the categories of experience points you can give out is religious experience points, which is really vague. It's like if the players have a religious experience, you can give them some level of experience points that seems right. And so that I sort of went with that, and it's like, okay, well, when you find these little shrines or you find these ancient temples, you get sort of experience points just for experiencing them. And I kind of had this whole complicated, when I first conceptualized the thing, I had this whole complicated system where it was like if you were a channeling guy, you would get more experience for the channeling place, and then there'd be the mentalism place over here, and the mental, and that's probably ultimately that was probably unnecessary, but that was just one way I was trying to like get kind of experience points into the game. Just but you can also just kill an emu by yourself. So right, because like the big thing in Rolemaster is like the first time you kill a given type of creature, you get ×5 the experience points, and then some creatures have like bonus experience points, and that's also ×5. And then the second time you kill one, it's still ×2. But so there's this idea of like, well, you really want to like fight stuff, and then that's where you get the big experience points. And so I was keeping an eye on that. Like when you were fighting the frog, like you were actually pretty close to killing the frog, and I had the frog start running away, and I was sort of like, kind of conscious of like, well, if you chase after this frog and kill it now, then you're going to get that ×5 experience bonus, which would have been a lot, by the way. But if you come back and have to fight it again later, then this is your second time fighting the frog, and you're only going to get ×2. So I was trying to like push, like in terms of how I was approaching combat, I was trying to like pushing that as an element of what kind of the risk reward thing that combat is about. Do you want to keep this encounter going because you're trying to get this big reward? And I think just pursuit and a lot of the movement rules and the kind of like things about like the movement penalties for armor, I think do come from like a wargamey kind of caring about pursuit and retreat and pursuit. And I do think that's kind of like part of making to me that was part of making the combats interesting, is kind of caring about that, like, well, if these guys run away from you, can you chase after them, or should you chase after them, or should you just let it go? And so I kind of wanted to dig into that a little bit, in addition to the effects on experience points, just how the tactical situations developed and what was interesting about them.
And that came through really strongly, especially with the giant frog. I think we were like right on the precipice of going after it. We really there's so much to do, but it gave some texture to our priorities.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And
I would say in the rules as written, if I were to play Rolemaster, I probably would revisit and bump up the experience points, because I do remember it being fairly dispiriting that after all, we'd been learning the culture and really engaging, and then we killed a fucking emu that wandered across the path, and suddenly we all like that.
Yeah.
This doesn't feel quite aligned yet,
Yeah, I guess that's true. You could really rebalance that to make cultural experience points a thing. But yeah, so I think that's I think that's mainly what I wanted to talk about. I guess if I was gonna, we can sort of get into anything you want to say to wrap it up. If I was gonna say anything to kind of wrap up, I would just like kind of talk about what I would do like next time. And I've talked about this with, I think, probably both of you on different occasions before, but one, less, no, not 13 cultures, maybe 7 is what I'm going with right now, but maybe. So I'd really like to, if I were going to do another Rolemaster, I'd really like to do another Rolemaster where we like kind of back off of like the really trying to go far afield into my own fantasy a little bit, maybe do something a little more conventionally medieval, but concentrate on using these mechanics more or iterating them faster. And so making like a setting where maybe there's like 7 different regions and you kind of move around the regions doing different adventures. And every time you go to a different region, you roll for an event, which we did do in the game. One guest went like on a little side trip to a different region, and whenever that happens, you're supposed to roll for an event. And the events are like, typically they're like famines or wars or things or religious conflicts that at the very minimum, well, you could get no event, or you could get one of these events that at the very minimum, they tend to make the chance of having a hostile encounter higher, but they also have just whatever, fictional consequences they have, or like if there's a war or a religious thing. And so I was thinking when I was making these cultures of trying to like make sure like every different culture had a couple of like different kind of power groups inside it that would be the ones who would be in conflict if there was, these guys would be in conflict if there was a religious conflict. Right. These guys would be, if there was a coup or something, it would probably be this guy trying to overthrow that guy. And so if I were going to do it again, I would, like I said, have a bit of a smaller map, but kind of try to set it up so there's more moving around from region to region, because in this game, like I really super developed the Northern Islands with a bunch of all these different clans, and they've got their own government, and they've got like these different places you can go, and I would probably less places to go per region, a little less complexity per region, but more of like a cross region complexity that really encourages you to move and kind of like interact with these mechanics and kind of get the ball rolling in terms of these events, these event rolls potentially changing situations around the map. That's what I would do, I think, if I were to do it again and see where that goes. But do either of you have any kind of last minute sum up or thoughts or things that you would want to get out about this game or Rolemaster in general?
I think I have expressed my features I really enjoy about it, and I would, like I say, I'm interested in playing more. I'm interested in kind of doing my own thing with it too, and I have a lot of respect for the folks who made it. I think they were onto some really good ideas. Like you say, some of the best ideas in it haven't really been picked up by many other people making games sense. So well worth the time spent playing it and reading it.
Yeah. Noah, any thoughts?
No, nothing grand.
Okay.
But it was a lot of fun. And,
okay. I think it was.
I think, and I feel lucky that I kind of got to jump in, after both of you had done some design work to figure out how to make it work well. Because I think, with both of you, I think we were able to kind of start with where the system worked well and kind of zoom in on what was most interesting about it. And so I got to just benefit from that, which I really appreciate.
Okay. Yeah, no, it was a lot. Hopefully, one of these days, more Rolemaster to come. But thanks for talking, and I guess I'll go ahead and call this done.
Cool.
And